So with that, I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Clarke Knight. Dr. Knight graduated from UC Berkeley's PhD program in Environmental Science, Management, and Policy in 2021, where she researched the historical ecology of California's mixed conifer forests. She is currently a postdoctoral scholar at the U.S. Geological Survey and is focused on producing well-dated, high-resolution reconstructions of past climates. Dr. Knight is using these reconstructions to understand climate variability in Western North America, particularly extreme hydraulic events. Prior to moving to California, Dr. Knight earned degrees from the University of Oxford and Smith College. She was born and raised in Las Vegas, Nevada, and credits her hometown as the catalyst for her interest in environmental issues. We are glad to have her speaking here today. Go ahead.
Well, thanks so much, Rachel. It was really great to have that introduction, and I'm excited to be here today with you all. So let me get started. I'm going to be speaking today about some of the work I did as a PhD student, and that work has taken place in the Klamath bioregion. So the title of my talk is Historical Role of Fire in the Klamath Mountains, California. And this is a really lovely picture of the Trinity Alps. It's a really beautiful area. And as you can see here, it has this really nice lake here in the center. And that's going to be really important coming up because a lot of my work is based on using paleo ecological records that are from lake sediments. So the fact that this area has a lot of lakes has been really great for my research. So as you probably are aware, this bioregion is a really important one in California. So it's in the northwestern part of California. And it has a high degree of floristic diversity. It has a lot of endemic conifer species. It's topographically varied. You can see it has mountains, it has valleys, it has a lot of rivers, and it has a lot of interesting soil as well. So this is an example here on the bottom of some serpentine soil. And as I just mentioned, the area has a lot of these small lake sites that have been produced from glacial retreat as well as landslides. And there's something like 83 lakes in this area that are good candidates for paleoecological work. And you might also know, because you are interested in forestry, that there are two main fire regimes in California. And this is important as background for my work because I'm going to be thinking about fire regimes over a 3,000-year period in the Klamath area. And in contrast with the south of California, which has a fire regime predominantly characterized by lower frequency and higher severity fires because of the predominance of chaparral in that region, is that the northern part of California has fire regimes that have tended to be high frequency, so occurring really often, but low severity. So they don't have high mortality of the trees in that area. And this is part of what's well known in this area in terms of the millennial length for its stewardship, is that a lot of this area has been stewarded by the folks that have been in this area for millennia. And we have a lot of traditional ecological knowledge from Northwestern California, particularly with regards to my work. I collaborated with members of the Karuk and Yurok tribe. You can see here their traditional territories are shown in these outlines, and you can find more maps like this at the Native Land Project. The web address is shown here below. But this is really important to consider for the historical ecology of this region because there's been indigenous influence on this landscape for quite a while. And by that, I mean cultural burning practices, land stewardship, and practices that are actually ongoing to this day. So one of my collaborators, Dr. Frank Lake, took this photo, and it appeared in one of his recent publications where they're doing a prescribed cultural burn up in Six Rivers National Forest, which intersects with the Klamath bioregion. They're actually burning bare grass here. And so my interest in California forest has stemmed in part from just the character of the forests themselves. These forests are vast. They make up something like 33 million acres on California's landscape. They're really valuable from a lot of different dimensions, whether it's from a recreation perspective, an economic perspective, an ecological perspective, and they're really threatened. So we know that from 21st century climate change that's been occurring, that we've seen a really huge increase in megafires on the landscape. So these catastrophic fires that are quite large and they're destructive, they cause high mortality in our forests. And that's been coupled with hot droughts that have been occurring across the state as well. We're in an unprecedentedly dry period in terms of the last 1,500 years in our state. And together, these have really put the integrity of our forests at risk. And so fire suppression is one of the main issues that I've been thinking about in my research. And it's this policy that has been a federal and state policy used to prevent and extinguish fires if they started. And this began shortly after the Forest Reserve System was established in 1905. And it not only included the suppression of fire, but also supported building infrastructure, so roads and ranger stations and these communication systems to get fires put out quickly in remote areas. And of course, you're probably familiar with the Smokey Bear campaign, so there was a public communication side to this as well. And it's thought that in pre-suppression forests is that we were having conditions that were more open and park-like, and that were maintained by these low severity fires, and that produced, this ongoing health of the forest, this mosaic of different stand types across the entire forest ecosystem. But that with fire suppression, we have these situations where the forest becomes really overstocked because we don't have fire in the landscape. And so when fire does inevitably come through, it becomes very severe and it causes a high degree of mortality in those forests, and we lose a lot of that integrity. This is, of course, really important in California because the state is banking on using its forests to store carbon and combat climate change. And so these are some pictures from my field sites up in the Klamath area, Six Rivers area, where we have these really high density forests that you can see on the left, which again, when a fire comes through, will cause these high mortality kind of moonscape atmospheres where you have just a bunch of dead trees for all around you where the fire was hitting. And this is a really big problem. So it motivated me in my PhD to want to look at and evaluate long-term data sets about forest biomass and fire to really improve the evidence base for management decisions going forward, particularly those that are geared towards restoration of any kind. And so that brings me to what I'm going to be talking to you about today, which is the Paleo Ecology or historical ecology of this area. And Paleo Ecology just meaning the study of the past ecosystem processes on a landscape. And my work really spans from the late Holocene, about 3,000 years ago, through the modern era. And I punctuated 2 time points, the colonial era in the 1880s, because I did some work using witness tree data collected from the general land surveys in the 1880s in California, as well as the modern era. And I have 2018 because that is when I conducted really detailed field surveys around my lake sites. And so with this talk, I'm going to be showing you how I reconstructed forest density and fire history in this area from several different data sets. So there's pollen from lake sediments. So the lake sediments I've been mentioning are about to come up, as well as charcoal from those lake sediments, fire scars from tree stumps in the area, and then combining that with traditional ecological knowledge from members of the Karuk and Yurok tribes, as well as these historical inventories from the 1880s. And because I don't want to assume that you know much about the study of pollen or other paleoecology basics, I just want to give a really brief overview of some of the methods that I use so you can hopefully visualize better what I was up to. So the first one I want to talk about is pollen analysis. And pollen I like to think of as time machines for understanding the ecology of the past. And this is a really nice picture of what pollen grains look like. They come in different shapes and different sizes. And what's great about them is that the shape and size of those pollen grains can be linked to the genera of, or the taxa type that produced it. And so that's really valuable because you can look at pollen from thousands, even millions of years ago and know what kind of vegetation released that pollen grain into the atmosphere that was then incorporated into lake sediments. And so you might be wondering how that process actually works. And so this is a nice example of all of the pollen that can come off of a tree. So, trillions, quadrillions of spores just from one single tree coming down. And so then if you imagine an entire forest giving off pollen like this, is that you're going to have just an absolute superabundance of pollen grains in the atmosphere. And pollen grains are, of course, used by the tree in order to pollinate and have reproduction occur. But what actually ends up happening is that the vast majority of pollen grains do not end up pollinating anything. And in fact, they end up in places like, the hood of your car or in street gutters. And as a paleo scientist, they end up a lot of the times in lakes. And so this is really great for the work I want to do. This is a picture actually of Crater Lake up in Oregon. And there's a really beautiful pollen swirl occurring on the surface of this lake. And it gives you insight into some of the dynamics that happen when pollen gets into a lake. So it'll usually, there'll be dynamics where it's really well mixed in the lake, and then it'll sink through the lake water to the sediment and become incorporated in those lake sediments, and then buried over time as more sediment is put into the lake. And so then if you go and you core that lake, you're able to get a record of the pollen inputs. And so this lake basically is acting like a giant collecting basin for pollen. And I'd like to just mention that pollen is predominantly from the vegetation right around the lakes. And that's even more true the smaller the lake becomes. And so for my work, what I did is I obtained lake sediment cores from 7 different lakes up in this area. And these are just some nice examples from this field work. And these are chock-a-block full of pollen. So that's what I was looking at to do this work. And I'll be showing some results of that in a minute. But I want to take you more deeply into 2 lake sites that I worked on, which is a result, I discussed them in much more detail in our latest publication with the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. But we focused on 2 lake sites that are in a very interesting place in this part of the world, because both Fish Lake, shown here in A, and Lake Agaramtok were in areas of, at least Fish Lake was an area of joint use between the Karuk and the Yurok tribes, and Lake Agaramtok was a sacred site for the Karuk tribe. And both of these lake sites became really good sites to take lake sediments in order to understand past vegetation history, as well as charcoal. And you can see here these red dots, which are sites where we got fire scars. And so this became a really great area to reconstruct this past history of fire and vegetation changes. And so what we did then was we looked at the pollen record from these lakes. And in case you're wondering, the most predominant type of pollen that I was looking at actually came from pine pollen. So it looks like, this Mickey Mouse. And then Douglas fir pollen, shown here, kind of this Pac-Man shape. And then tan oak and other types of oak pollen. You can see here this really nice SEM image. And we combine that pollen record with a charcoal record. So as I mentioned, charcoal is another method for looking at past fire on the landscape. And what happens is that if you have a fire, you get the production of charcoal with the burning up of that carbon. It creates these smoke plumes that carry charcoal in the atmosphere that is then deposited into a lake, or it combusts and is put in the soil, and then through surface runoff, those sediments end up in the lake as well. So that much like when you core a lake to get pollen, those sediment cores also contain a lot of pieces of charcoal. So charcoal is just another way of getting a proxy for past fire signals. And so we combined, charcoal, pollen, and these fire scars to understand better what was happening in this area. And so here's some of our data. So I have plotted here one example from Fish Lake, where we have charcoal as this orange line, which is in pieces or particles per centimeter squared per year. And if you just look qualitatively at what is going on with the charcoal signal over about 3,000 years, so we have our calibrated years on the x-axis, and our y-axis basically shows increasing or decreasing amounts of charcoal in the landscape, is that we see this strong uptick in charcoal with a lot of variability, but some really big peaks in charcoal through what's known as a medieval climate warming. And this is an anomalously dry and hot time in California. And then we still see an increase of charcoal through the Little Ice Age as well, whereby it rapidly decreases and goes to some of its lowest points in the entire record, which correspond with the modern period. So this timescale actually ends in 2008. And so the period of the last 100 years or so, we see this really steep drop off of charcoal accumulation in lake sediments, which really corresponds to fire suppression in this area. And so if you look at this again visually at our other lake site, Lake Agaramtok, where we did a deep dive, is again, over the past 3,000 years, we see this strong amount of increase in the charcoal record, just from a qualitative perspective, that peaked in this case in the Little Ice Age, and then again, dramatically decreased through the modern period. And so just from a visual inspection, this is giving us some information about charcoal accumulation over time and these peaking events in the Little Ice Age, which, much like the medieval climate warming, is an anomalous time period, except that instead of being drier and warmer, it's cooler and wetter during this time period. And so it led us to try to make a conceptual model for what we think was going on in this area. So for example, if you just want to think about climate as being a really important driver of change, vegetation change on a landscape, this is what you might expect from changes in climate. So during a hotter and drier period, like for example, what we're in now, you might expect to see more fire on the landscape because those fuels on the ground are going to be really dry. And then that would lead to forest opening and the promotion of shade intolerant taxa. So those are things like oaks. Whereas if you're in a period of cooler and wetter climate, you might expect less fire in the landscape because those fuels don't dry out as much, and that forest closure is promoted, and shade tolerant taxa like pines and firs and that sort of thing are promoted above and beyond oaks, for example. And what we did is we wanted to see what we might expect if we assume there was an anthropogenic impact on the landscapes. So for example, if there was human-caused vegetation under this conceptual model during a cooler and wetter period, such as the Little Ice Age, we might actually expect to see more fire on the landscape to compensate for the fact that there wasn't as much ignition happening naturally. That would promote forest opening as well as the promotion of these shade intolerant taxa. And so we looked at this, qualitatively. I just showed you some of the charcoal results, but we also wanted to look at it quantitatively. So what we did is we took our data, and I'm just showing an example of Fish Lake here, and we wanted to see if there was a correlation between our charcoal accumulation and this measure of vegetation openness. It's called VRI. And we looked at this period of climatic cooling in the Little Ice Age, which is from about 600 to 100 calibrated years BP. And what we actually found was a significant and positive correlation between how much charcoal there was on the landscape and that it was increasing, as well as the increasing openness of the vegetation during this cooler, wetter period. And so what we found is that our data show this positive and significant correlation that goes against climatic expectations. And so we ran then again this analysis with our other lake site, and we found the same thing. We found this significant and positive correlation between increasing amounts of charcoal, aka fire, and this vegetation openness. So this was really exciting. This confirmed what we had visually seen in a qualitative way from the long-term charcoal record. And so we were quite excited about what this might mean. But we wanted to look at some other paleo fire proxies just to see if we could kind of collaborate or corroborate what we were seeing on the landscape from the sediment record. So we turned to fire scars, and fire scars occur when trees are wounded from fire but are not killed, and the bark cells of those trees are injured, and the tree tries to protect itself by burying that wound, and it basically becomes like a tree ring record. So you can see there are tree rings in here, but also fire scars when fires occurred. And so what's great is that those fire wounds can be dated, much like tree rings can, and past fire events can be determined from looking at these cookies of tree stumps, as they're called. And so when we did this for the trees around, some of the stumps around our lake sites, is what we found was a lot of fires were occurring between about 1650 and 1900. And then we saw this complete drop off of no fires being recorded on the trees after about 1910, which is consistent with fire suppression in this area. And this is, I believe, Fish Lake, and the same thing occurred at Lake Agaramtaka as well. And so this was quite compelling to us. You know, we saw from our fire scar record that there was really frequent fire between about 1700 and 1900. And in fact, when you look at the median fire return intervals, they're very rapid. So at Fish Lake, it was about every 7 years, Lake Agaramtaka every 12 years. And this is almost certainly an underestimate of the fire on the landscape, because not all trees form a scar, even if they're burned. So this is very likely just on the conservative side of what actually occurred on this landscape. And what was also interesting, although inconclusive in this work, is the positionality of the scars themselves. So we found, and this is work led by Dr. Eric Knapp, we found that about 80 to 90% of scars were occurring in the late wood and the dormant wood of the tree ring. And that is timed with the cultural burning that we know was occurring on this landscape from members of the Karuk and Yurok tribes, who are telling us that these burns for cultural purposes were occurring in the late fall and early spring, whereas lightning-induced fire was occurring much earlier in the year, say around June and July. So it's not conclusive from this data, but it is a kind of interesting proposition to think that maybe our fire scar is actually reflecting predominantly cultural burns as opposed to the lightning fire regime. And so this brings me to kind of a broad point, I think, about paleoecology and native stewardship when you're doing this kind of research. And so what was really beneficial to this project is talking and learning from the folks who have lived in the area for millennia, particularly if they're implicated in the research. And so that's why we collaborated with members of the Karuk and Yurok tribe, because they helped us understand the role that they had in influencing past ecosystems. You know, they're able to tell us what their stewardship was like, why they were doing certain practices, you know, what the relationship between human ignitions and natural ignitions was, and also, you know, where to look for records. So these two lake sites were really great because we knew that there was indigenous presence around these lakes. They were using them for cultural and religious reasons. So that made them really great places to look for these effects. And as well as the fact that, you know, the interpretation of this record is really important. So you want to include people who are part of this landscape and who know a lot about it into the production of these scientific reports. And there's been a lot of research done on this area. So I have some resources here at the bottom from things that I've read and been influenced by. And with that, we did this, we followed this tribal policy called Practicing Pikiav, which was started through the Karuk and UC Berkeley collaborative. And it's a policy that is about fixing or repairing. That's what the word Pikiav means. And what it really did that was powerful was it gave us clear guidelines for initiating and carrying out this collaborative project. And it included things like informed consent, data sharing, mutually agreed upon expectations for the collaboration, as well as a tribal review process before the publication was, before there was publishing of the manuscript. And this really helps protect traditional and tribal intellectual property. And we think was just a really, you know, wonderful way to do this kind of research. So I wanted to just mention that, you know, we engaged in this process and it was really beneficial to the production of this project. And so now I'm going to move into how we actually combine some of that traditional ecological knowledge from the Karuk and Yurok tribes with some of the other data that we were able to collect from this area, namely those historical inventories from the colonial era or the 1880s. So what we know from these tribes and others in this area is that indigenous burning was evolving over time along with their land stewardship. So we know that there have been folks in this area since at least the terminal Pleistocene, and that they've been applying, you know, sophisticated kinds of fire technology onto their landscape. So there's something like 70 uses of fire that have been documented in the literature from this area. And this kind of pyrodiversity coupled with the lightning fire regime really gave us this mosaic of vegetation in the area. And that this kind of fire was, the cultural use of this fire was also kind of evolving and diversifying over time, much like our technology today changes every year. And in fact, there's a really interesting set of archaeological records from what's called the Tulawatt pattern, which is from about 1500 years before present onwards, where we saw this influx of people into the Klamath bioregion from further north and west that led to population growth, more intense land usage, and most likely more burning on the landscape. So there's a lot of really interesting anthropological research from this area that we also drew on to inform ourselves as we started this project. And what we found through these oral histories and traditional ecological knowledge from the Karuk and Yurok is that it suggests a substantial contribution to the fire regime. So historically speaking, both Fish Lake and Lake Agaramtok were gathering sites for acorns and mushrooms and other crops. And that in order to cultivate crops like that, you needed to have lower fuel levels around these lakes in more open forest. And the best kind of estimate of populations that we were able to find was this estimate from Charkov and Charkov in the 70s that said about 2,000 to 3,000 people were living in this area before Euro-American colonization, which gives you just an idea of how many people would be needed to be fed in this area. And from the contemporary oral histories that were conducted by Dr. Frank Lake, is they found that tribal members already are very aware of the fact that their traditional lands are over-enriched in biomass. And in fact, some members of the Karuk talk about these current modern forest conditions by calling them an ecological and cultural desert. So this is not a place where they can grow crops. This is a place that has way too many fuels on the ground to do a lot of their traditional practices. And in fact, one Karuk elder said, "We've never had this much fuel on the ground." And so that's a lot of really important perspective on what this landscape looked like from these two tribes in the area. And so when we think about how this started changing, a really big turning point in this area was during colonization. And colonization occurred much later in the northwestern part of California, starting about 1850, 1880s, compared to, say, Southern California, or even the Point Reyes area with the Spanish mission influence occurring in the 1700s. And so we were able to get our hands on a lot of really great colonial era records through the General Land Office survey records, which I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides. And these are written records that tell us a lot about the trees on this landscape. And it's important to be looking at this period because, at least for the Klamath, this is giving us a snapshot of what this landscape looked like before, fire suppression policies, before widespread logging, before a lot of these big 20th century changes that occurred on this landscape. And it's also going to give us a way to check on the consistency that they may or may not have with our records from the Paleo Ecological side. So looking at, what do the General Land Office survey records say compared to, say, our lake sediment records from the reconstruction. So it's been a good cross-check. So in case you were wondering what these forests might look like, in like a visual sense, we were able to find this photo from 1910, which shows the same lake in 1910 versus 2010. And you can see just how much this landscape has filled in, and how you could, say, stand in an area around this lake 100 plus years ago and have a lot more visibility around you in all areas. There was much more patchiness, at least from this photo. And we wanted to understand, okay, what did that look like at a landscape level? Regionally, what was actually happening? Can we quantify that structure and composition? And that's where the importance of the public land survey data comes in. So the map on the left is showing all the areas in the US where the public land survey was conducted. And these surveys gave tree inventory data between about 1872 and 1884 in this area, and they had this regional coverage. And I'd just like to note that these public land surveys were actually conducted to facilitate colonization and settlement of the land by, dividing it up into these little squares. And so I just want to make note that that was its real purpose. It was less about the ecological side, although we are using it in that way. It had a very different social purpose back then. But what the record looks like, this is an example here of some field notes from this area where you have different subdivisions and they write down what the different trees are in this area, as well as their type and size and their position to these known, what they're called as quarter corners, so that you can reconstruct what was actually happening on the landscape from the positionality in the documents. And so I was able to extract something like 21,000 different tree records from these notes in this area and see that there was a profound structural change on this landscape. So when you look at the historic period shown here in black from about the 1880s, compared to the contemporary period, this is from FIA data from 2010, as you can see that there's been a tripling in terms of the density, in terms of stems per hectare on this landscape, as well as a tripling in basal area between the historic period and the modern period. So a mass densification in about 130 years on this landscape. And we also wanted to understand what compositional change might have occurred. So I mentioned the General Land Office survey also took note of the different types of trees on the landscape. So what we did is we looked at the different taxa here shown on the x-axis and looked at their relative dominance by basal area between the historic period and the contemporary. And what we found was some big shifts. So in Douglas fir, there's was about 34% on the landscape back in 1880, and now it's about 45% of the landscape. Pines haven't changed that much, but oaks have declined significantly since the historic period. They were about 21% of the landscape in the 1880s, but are now only about 9%. And this mirrors a lot of other research that has come out of California, which has shown this decline in oaks through time. We've lost a lot of our oak savannas, and you can see this here in the Six Rivers data set as well. And we think that fire suppression was likely playing a major role in driving these densification trends. So I pulled data from the Historic Archive of Wildfire Events, which is maintained by CAL FIRE, our state agency that does a lot of work on fire in California. And what we found is that fire, according to this data set, was really low in terms of area burned in hectares. I've shown it here by decade. And then in the last 20 years, of course, the amount of fire in the landscape has really increased rapidly. But for about 100 years, we had really well suppressed fire in this area, at least according to this data set, which would make sense with the densification trends that I was just showing you. So I want to now walk through, as the last part of my talk, the biomass reconstruction that we're able to produce over the long term in this area. And so I want to show you kind of some visualizations of what a low biomass forest might look like through this top panel. And so this is an area where you have this high degree of visibility around you if you're walking through this forest. Fire could come through here and burn a lot of the ground fuels, but would likely not have enough continuous fuels to become a highly severe, high mortality event. Whereas these high biomass conditions, which these are photos that I took during fieldwork, really show a high degree of continuity between the canopies of the trees. So if a fire does occur, it's really going to be able to spread easily across these stands. And so that's the high biomass forest of today compared to what it might have looked like in the past. And so we took, again, this mixed methods approach. I've shown you some of the tribal ethnographies. I've told you a little bit about the paleo records, and then I provided this other line of evidence through the General Land Survey, which I'm now going to link all of these things together. And so this is what we did. We reconstructed biomass, and here we have predicted above ground live biomass in megagrams per hectare. And again, our calibrated years BP. So this is our oldest records here at the left, and then our youngest record is from 2008. And for one example, Lake Agaramtak, we think we're seeing at least 1 millennia of indigenous stewardship on this landscape. So our low biomass shown here, this 100, 200 range, and then our really high biomass levels of today, over 300 megagrams per hectare in some areas. And our reconstructed biomass over this 3,000 year period shows very low biomass for a long period of time before an absolute skyrocket in the modern period. And in fact, if you look at the median tree biomass until colonization, it was very low. It was only about 104 megagrams per hectare on this landscape until colonization, which occurred about 1850 here, which seems to be this turning point in our record where we again see this really strong increase on the landscape, likely due to fire suppression. And so actually, if you break it down a little bit and just look at our record in terms of the last 2 centuries of contemporary stewardship, is you can start to see where certain events may have played a role in the biomass record. So, we have our gold rush invasion, our colonization event in 1850, we have the beginning of fire suppression, and at least in 6 Rivers, we have the creation of the national forest, which is when timber harvest begins in this area in 1947, which is timed with this drop in biomass, which may reflect those harvest events. And then we see when harvests are restricted in about the 70s in this area is that the biomass record responds immediately, and we get these increases in biomass until we get to 2008, which is we're at this really high contemporary level. And again, we wanted to try to check on the consistency of this pollen-derived biomass record by comparing it to those public land surveys. And so the public land surveys estimate biomass to be about 100 megagrams per hectare in 1880. And our independently derived record is showing just about 100 megagrams per hectare at the same time period. So we were really pleased that there was this consistency between these 2 really different ways of looking at forest structure in this landscape. And so in some, some of our main findings come down to the Karuk and Yurok ethnographic data, which say that these watersheds and the fire scar histories indicate that Indigenous stewardship was important and likely contributed substantially to the fire regime. And so, integrating that paleo perspective with the ethnographic record becomes a powerful way of looking at the ecology in this area. And in fact, when you look at the contemporary forest biomass, it's unprecedentedly high in terms of the past 3,000 years of data from our lake sites. And I think that that's been a big wake-up call to me as an ecologist and how these systems have developed, and just thinking about how different they are today and versus what they were in the past. And our biomass record also strongly suggests that it was frequent fire that was limiting this biomass on the landscape, because as soon as you took fire away, we saw this really huge increase in biomass, which shows just how productive these sites can be without fire, taking out trees and reducing that biomass. So, that's another really important part here, is that a lot of this is controlled by frequent fire. And we think that Indigenous forest and fire management was therefore critical to maintaining those forest conditions before colonization and before fire suppression. And again, we have this confidence in our proxy analyses because we had these consistent biomass predictions from these independent lines of evidence, not just the general land surveys, but also from the oral histories from members of these tribes who are really confidently stating what they know was occurring on this landscape and how they used it. And so it comes down to this question of restoration ecology, where we talk about restoring the landscape, but a key question becomes restoring it to what? And if we put some numbers on this, we might be able to strategize a bit better. And in fact, with our findings, a larger scale intervention could be needed to achieve historical fidelity if that's a goal from managers in this area. And particularly with California's expectations that forests will store a lot of carbon for a long time, this is kind of tempering that by showing that much lower levels of carbon were on the landscape when you had frequent fire. And I think, from a personal perspective, is increasing engagement with tribes is another really great way to go, particularly the restoration of native burning practices. And so If we're going to resolve this tension that the state has between what they want to do with policy and what the carbon ecology likely is in this landscape, is using those resources that we have with folks who want to restore cultural burning, is just a potentially really good win-win situation. And so with that, I want to thank the members of these tribes who collaborated and co-authored this report that we have just published. And I also want to thank the many collaborators who helped me collect all of this data, because there are so many different data sets that you were able to see here. And it took really a huge team of people to make that happen. So I'm really thankful for my collaborators with all of this work. And I just want to say thank you for listening. And I can see some questions in the chat, so I'd be happy to start getting to those. So thank you so much for staying online.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Knight, for that presentation. And we have some folks who are really interested in throwing some questions your way, so we'll start right off. Jean asked, does the pollen rot, or does it have hard parts that remain?
Oh, that's a great question. So no, pollen doesn't rot. The outside of pollen is made up of something called sporopollenin, which is an extremely resilient polymer, and it is actually able to last and be preserved in lake sediments for upwards of millions of years. And that's, one reason why it's such a good proxy for past vegetation, is because it's not impacted from, just being in lake sediments for thousands to millions of years. So good question.
Great. Colleen asked, is tan oak included within the oak category that you mentioned as declining in the last 100 years?
Yes, so tan oak will be included. One thing I wish that had happened with the public land survey is that the folks in the 1880s who were doing the surveys would have been more careful botanists. So a lot of the time they would lump tan oak and oak into the same kind of oak category. So sometimes when we see oak in the records, we don't really know if it's tan oak or if it's blue oak or black oak or these different kinds of oaks that we know are on the landscape. So we do assume that tan oak has been lumped into that oak category.
Great.
Yeah.
And then Michael wanted to throw out a concept, which was to measure the stem density of trees under 150 years old within unmanaged or non-plantation stands. And he suggested that this cohort is an indication of fire suppression induced forest structure.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, 150 years, under 150 years old would definitely capture a fire suppression signal within this area. Yeah, that's a good point.
Will mentioned that this and other research documents the role of contemporary suppression practices on elevating fuels levels and increasing fire risk. He then asked, how can we use this science to require environmental compliance for the continued practice of 100% fire exclusion policies?
Yeah, I mean, I think, my job is just to keep communicating the findings from these studies with you all. And I'm really interested in talking to the general public and to policymakers in general. I know folks in California are very aware of this issue and are trying to make those modifications so that we can get more fire in the landscape. So I am hopeful and taking heart in a lot of the really great folks in agencies, the state agencies here in California, particularly those in the California Air Resources Board and in CAL FIRE. So, and also thanks for your nice comments too, Will, about our publications.
Great. I had another question for you.
Sure.
So you touched on this regarding the Pikiav, but to take it a bit further, what steps did you take to build a positive collaborative relationship with the Indigenous tribes in your study landscape?
Yeah, so I was really fortunate in that UC Berkeley and the Karuk tribe have had a long-standing research collaborative, and that a lot of trust and relationships have been built among scholars at UC Berkeley and members of this tribe in particular. I also say that some of the co-authors and collaborators that I mentioned, so a lot of the folks on this list have been working with members of this tribe previously on other projects. And so that again allowed me to begin this project with an understanding of that there's trust and collegiality and collaboration as part of our kind of research ethic. So that was a huge part, like all the people that came before me who've done really great work. And then the practicing Pikiav, it has been really fundamental because it formalizes a lot of that relationship building. You know, you present, I presented our project to the Research Council of the Karuk tribe. So we were able to talk about what I wanted to do and, you know, concerns and risks to the tribe that might be present. We talked through those and we made an agreement that, you know, we literally signed where we, you know, talked about data sharing and the timeline of the project and what the expectations on me were. And then there was a tribal review process at the end where I was given some really thoughtful comments about how to discuss traditional ecological knowledge and how to present those results, you know, respectfully and ethically. And so, yeah, I mean, just the whole time, just keeping up that communication is a really key part and being receptive to feedback. And I think it made the science really strong and much stronger than it would have been had we not engaged with members of these tribes.
Great, thank you for that explanation. Bill asked, or started by stating, during the pre-colonization period, there was a lot of variation in fire frequency from the fire star and charcoal analysis, with periods of several decades with a lot of fire followed by several decades with very little, if any, fire. What explains those oscillations? Tribal population levels, too wet to burn at times, a deliberate cessation of burning practices for a period of time, or other explanations?
Yeah, so it's definitely hard to know what those exact oscillations are. So part of, you know, working with data sets like this is that you can't get the kind of spatial resolution that you can in modern ecological projects. And so, you know, you might see these gaps of a decade, but those are based on age models that we've produced for these records. And so, you know, basically I'm saying we caution from overinterpreting wiggles in the record and instead are looking for general trends. And that's, we were able to pick up on those trends from the correlation analysis that we did, where we found these significant associations between variables. But in terms of, you know, looking at, you know, changes, wiggles in the record is, you know, we actually don't try to do that with these kinds of data sets. But I can imagine you've given some really nice examples actually of what might have occurred on the landscape in terms of like higher use patterns over time, maybe influxes of new people or movement of villages. Those would be very plausible reasons for why you might see variation in past fire events. But in terms of getting that from our data, that it's just a stretch too far to get it from the kind of resolution we actually have.
Great, thank you. And we're having some good conversation over in the chat.
Oh, great.
Gabrielle
I'm trying to keep up, yeah.
Or Gabrielle mentioned that although frequent fire forests have lower overall level of carbon storage capacity, it's important to stress the fact that carbon storage is more stable when it is not at risk of loss to severe wildfire. I find that the stability of carbon storage is important when planning for long-term carbon storage. And then Will followed up on that to agree, talking about historic cultural fire regimes, creating a conveyor belt of sediment, large wood, and biochar that was critical for in-stream habitat. You're also getting lots of kudos on your presentation, and I would like to—
thanks, guys. Yeah, I absolutely agree with Gabrielle's comment. You know, thinking of the stability of carbon and, you know, if it's not at risk to loss of severe wildfire, as it was back before fire suppression policies, is that, yeah, you may be able to store a bit more. And that stability piece is really key for the long term. And that's, again, part of the crux of the problem with some of the policies put forward by the state, and then what the reality is on the ground right now is it's not staying long-term in the trees of the forest because they're so overdense. So yeah, that's a really important point to talk about, is the stability of carbon.
I would love for this conversation to continue on afterward, but for now we have another question.
Oh, sure.
Bill followed up to say that we are also entering GLO data to use for Southwest Oregon.
Oh,
the work
fantastic.
The work is tedious, but requires local knowledge. Was that part of your graduate work or was it separate? He's curious to hear how it was funded.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, keying in tree data is extremely tedious from those records. I actually did it all myself, my third year of my PhD, going through all of those records. And then, we've actually expanded and are looking at some records from other areas in California. We now have some undergraduate students who've been recruited through paid positions to transcribe those data sets. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear how that's going. And, the data set from Southern Oregon that you're working on will be really helpful in giving a clearer picture of this bioregion, because of course it extends beyond the boundary of California, and getting that Southern Oregon information will be really helpful for piecing together what was happening in this area.
Great. If it's all right with you, Clarke, I'll go ahead and post your contact information in the chat so that folks can get a hold of you afterward. Great. All right, so we have time for a few more questions. I was wondering, you mentioned this question of what does restoration mean and what condition are we trying to restore forests to? Yeah. So with that in mind, I guess I was just wondering how cultural use of fire is viewed today.
Well, I can talk about my own view, I guess, which is that I think it's a really great thing. And just from what I've seen in various news articles from publications ranging from, say, the New Yorker to local stations, I've heard actually stuff about prescribed fire on the radio and podcasts, and I think it's becoming a much more commonly understood practice, and people are trying to incorporate it into their prescribed fire plans. I know that there's been prescribed fire training actually with members of the tribe, and folks up in this area are trying to get more people who can be burn bosses and do this kind of work on the landscape. So I hope and think it's taking off and it's becoming a pretty accepted practice. I think there's still issues to work out in terms of liability of fires getting away from people, and there's these legal issues, and of course there are capacity issues, and a lot of this area is remote, so there's still some challenges on that end, but at least I hope that public opinion is kind of galvanizing around it.
Great, thank you. Will was wondering if your presentation is available online. I will be, this whole webinar has been recorded, and I will be posting that recording to YouTube and sending it out to everyone who is registered today, so you can view it then. But until then, Clarke, is this anywhere up on the web, this information?
Mostly in terms of the publications themselves, but this explanation through your YouTube channel, I think, will be the best way for people to just get that if they don't want to read the papers.
I would encourage everyone to go on and read those papers. Alrighty, so we just have a couple minutes left. I want to, again, go ahead and reiterate what everyone else is saying, which was that this is a great presentation. Thank you so much for doing this research and for coming on today to talk to everyone. And we hope to have you on in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here, for listening, and for asking great questions. It was a pleasure.